So this is part 3 of my reflection on the Magna Carta. Last time we had left off with clause number 12, and we're going to continue now with clause 13. Assizes of Darien presentment. Assizes of Darien presentment shall always be taken before our justices of the bench, and there shall be determined. So we're going to have to paint the landscape here. What exactly do all of these different strange words mean? So if we take the word Darien presentment, Darien, D-A-R-R-E-I-N, presentment, this comes from the Anglo-Norman French, where Darien means last or most recent, and presentment refers to the act of presenting a candidate for a church position, such as a priest or a rector, to a parish. Now the word assizes, if I'm saying that correctly, it's spelled A-S-S-I-S-E-S, refers to specific legal procedures, court sessions, dealing with property disputes and criminal cases. Now in the last clause we had talked a fair bit about this term. It was central to that clause. And what we came away with was fixed legal proceedings. We were concerned in the last clause with rightful inheritance or wrongful dispossession of land, this sort of thing. So it provided the people who wish to petition, proposition the King's Court with a cheaper, more effective way of having judicial support, of having cases of concern heard and decided upon. Now this clause seems to be an extension of that. We were just talking about a different type of assizes. And so why is this important? What is the context? I want to, just for a moment, briefly remind myself that when we go through this, there's two elements that we have to pay attention to. There's one element that has to do strictly with historical matters, and the interest that we find with something occurring within that period. It's just generally understanding the context of that environment. But then once we understand the context of the environment, understand why things are relevant at the period, we have to look at the broader symbolic significance. What element of the spirit of liberty, if we want to call it that, is being shown to us here? And how can we then see something a little bit more about our experience today or about our lives that is beneficial? And there may or may not be anything in particular. There may not be a particular genius to a specific clause, but the attempt here is to really extract out of this document, since it is a fundamental document in English history, the philosophical goods that are born from this. Okay, so again, these Darien presentment assizes. Darien, again, meaning last, most recent. Presentment refers to the act of presenting a candidate for a church position. Now this is operating under the assumption that the course is going to the case rather is going to be held locally. But also there raises this idea that in terms of the historical context, that this is being written in here because there were situations, perhaps many situations, in which either the king or the nobility had some dispute. Either it was noble between noble, noble between king. There is some dispute about how a church official would be appointed to a parish. Now, throughout English history, my mind focuses on three large elements. There's many, surely, near infinite elements that we can identify and discuss, but in terms of the bodies that are present in English society, now we're talking about the 13th century here. But I think about the king and the institutions therein. I think about the church, ecclesiastical authority. Now that I'm going through this, I'm thinking about four bodies. The ecclesiastical authority, the aristocracy or the nobility, and the commons. Now, as history progresses, or as it moves into the future, maybe it's a better way of saying it because sometimes it's hard to exactly identify what is progress. Let's just say as time moves forward, at least in terms of English history, I'm thinking about maybe 100 years after the Magna Carta was written, there is this gradual change in the dynamics between these bodies. And undeniably, there is an overlap between these bodies. The nobility are a part of the class of subjects under the king's dominion. The commons are also subjects, so they share that to a degree. They are separated by status, by wealth, authority, responsibility. Ecclesiastical authority, as we will discuss here, is quite ingrained into the secular apparatus, which we would call the kingship or the civil institutions. Speaking for a moment about the ecclesiastics, or that body, like I said, the institution of the church and the officials that make up that institution. The question in my mind is, well, what benefit is it of a noble, of a king, or of a disagreement among a group of nobles, perhaps, that they ought to have this authority of appointing a church official? What does that provide? And I think that in order to answer that question, we have to understand the function of the church during this period. So it can be said that there were economic benefits to that relationship of having the ability to appoint a church official, but just generally speaking, the church was an economic engine. It, I don't know how the grammar of this would actually work here, but the tithe, gathering a tithe from the parishioners, this is 10% of the productive labor. And this went to the person who controlled the church. The church often had lands that were associated with it, and they may have owned mills, farmland, markets. All of this generates income. And then, of course, other fees and donations, endowments. And part of this goes to the church, and then part of this goes to the person controlling the land, that noble. There was political and administrative power. In terms of local governance, we mentioned earlier, they're part of the king's judiciary was itinerant early on. They traveled from place to place, and there was really no solid, stable locale to address concerns. But the church was often the de facto administrative center. The priest could be a key advisor or act as a local official, helping the local noble enforce certain policies. So there's this overlap between that civil and church authority. And then the most obvious way in which the church is important, but also asserts authority and influence, is by shaping public morals and loyalties. The church and the associated clergy were often well educated. They served as scribes, record keepers, and ambassadors to foreign states. So given some thought, I think it readily becomes apparent when we think about the whole of a society as one piece of cloth, and there is a bunch of interwoven pieces of fabric that make up this cloth. And perhaps upon this cloth there are various designs that may have some relation to the structure of that fabric, but all the same, the fabric is the society itself. The way in which the different patterns are arranged depends on how the society chooses, or how a select few choose to orient that symbolically. And just reflecting on the relationship between the church and the state and the commons here, at least I think I can begin to appreciate this interwoven nature of things. That of the church functions that were mentioned, there is such an integration between the church and then everybody else, most of the population. And I wouldn't say that this is by any means antagonistic. Surely there are plenty of antagonistic elements to that relationship, which may have been brought about by the perennial tropes that plague the human mind, that plague the human heart, common throughout all ages. But I think it's clear why it would become problematic if there was some arbitrary usurpation of a particular prerogative, let's say of a noble or of a noble family, where, for whatever reason, over time, they had come to the position of influence such that they regularly elected these church officials. Of that process itself, I think there can be an analysis and perhaps some critical approach to that, but one can see how, in the absence of any overarching legal framework to decide how these positions ought to be delegated so that it prevents against arbitrary, like I said, arbitrary usurpation. I have some difficulty with that because, well, isn't it a bit arbitrary that the church has to rely on a noble to elect their officials? And I know that this wasn't the case in all cases, but that issue aside, going back to the point, in the case of weak law or arbitrary law, the king or a more powerful noble can exert their influence without any body or institution saying that, no, there is a way of things. It makes sense for this locale to be determined by this noble, whatever the case might be. There's a degree of justice, I think, that can be had there. This move away from the arbitrary actions of the monarch and more for this localized independence. That's what I would say is the primary takeaway from this clause. I'll read it one more time. Assizes of Darien presentment shall be always taken before our justices of the bench, and therefore shall be determined. Now, with an age of law that was quite weak, institutionally speaking, it seems like it's a bit open. The justices of the bench being a part of that civil pipeline of the monarch. I could see how that might in and of itself be an arbitrary process, that the judges may not be completely fair and objective, that there will be always this bend towards the monarchy because it is part of that tract. Technically, all of it is, but this is the interesting part about this document and about that society at the time. Clause 14. How men of all sorts shall be immersed, and by whom? The title of this clause reads, A free man shall not be immersed for a small fault, but after the manner of the fault, and for a great fault, after the greatness thereof, saving to him his contentment. 2. And a merchant likewise, saving to him his merchandise. 3. And any other's villain than ours shall be likewise immersed, saving his wainage, if he falls into our mercy. 4. And none of the said amerciaments shall be assessed, but by the oath of honest and lawful men of the vicinage. 5. Earls and barons shall not be immersed, but by their peers, and after the manner of their offense. 6. No man of the church shall be immersed after the quantity of his spiritual benefice, but after his lay tenement, and after the quality of his offense. So there are a few things that I certainly need to define before I can understand this verse. The first thing that I think I need to define here is the word immersed. Not sure if that's the way it's pronounced, but that's the way that I'm going to pronounce it. It is spelled Amerced. It comes from the Old French emercier, meaning to fine or to punish by a financial penalty. It is derived from the phrase a mercy, meaning at someone's mercy. In the context of medieval England, being immersed meant being fined at the discretion of a court or lord, rather than according to a fixed legal tariff. And so it sort of makes sense then, if it is not affixed to some codified law, then we are left to this arbitrary distinction. And as we know so far, the Magna Carta is a series of clauses to prevent the arbitrary way of things, the arbitrary relationships among different groups. How men of all sorts shall be immersed, and by whom? So beginning with the first subclause here, a free man shall not be immersed for a small fault, but after the manner of the fault, and for a great fault, after the greatness thereof, saving to him his contentment. So this first subclause is a bit philosophical, surprisingly enough. I feel like I'm reading a bit of Plato. So the first line before the semicolon, a freeman shall not be immersed for a small fault, but after the manner of the fault. Simple enough, I suppose, but there's an important distinction, especially as we progress farther into the clause, that there is this idea that was probable to be placed in effect in that society. Given that we are discussing a clause to prevent against it, I think we can safely assume that it was likely practiced. So outside of identifying this particular class of people, the free man, we're concerned about preventing against this arbitrary collecting of monies, financial penalty. The first big item here is the small fault. A free man shall not be amerced for a small fault. And I have to wonder here about the preciseness of this language. And I say that because I don't think the first part of this clause is suggesting that if somebody had committed some small fault, and that was that had some legal jurisdiction behind it, that there was some offense that could be prosecuted under law, that it ought not to be prosecuted, or that there ought not to be some sort of penalty, including a financial penalty. The important part is that we are identifying that the fault has some cause to it. It has some means. There is some method by which the fault has come to be. A small fault can be considered something as arbitrary. Anybody can walk down the street and have an issue of the way in which somebody is doing something. Sometimes I find myself in a rather negative disposition, and there are times that I am a bit more irritable than I ought to be. And I have to imagine that if I was of as Hume might put it, in more of a barbarous or a man of an inferior status, of more of an ancient disposition, that the small fault can be entirely arbitrary. It can be, the amercement can be placed based on a whim. Again, it can be placed on any small sense of irritability. Now, unlike Hume, I don't necessarily share certain sentiments that are attributed to certain ages. I do think that there are problems with feudal governance, but we have to remember here that what we are after from this interpretation and reflection is finding the spirit of liberty. And the spirit of liberty finds itself in all sorts of different contexts and in different ages. A free man shall not be amerced for a small fault, but after the manner of the fault. Again, after the way in which it has come to be, the way in which it happened. And for a great fault, after the greatness thereof. So this is another progression of this. I think it can be easy at first glance to say, well, is it the case then that a small fault ought not to be prosecuted, but only great faults ought to be prosecuted? And there's a philosophical difference between the great fault and the greatness of the fault. And for a great fault, after the greatness thereof. So it's not to say that small faults ought not to be prosecuted while only large ones ought to be. But it is in the essence or the degree of their quantity, let's say, or the quality of the transgression, such that the smallness and the greatness is the thing that matters. It is the manner of the fault. Saving to him his contentment. Another interesting aspect of this first subclause. And it's interesting, again, I hear David Hume in the background of my mind saying, these ignorant people, they would add such a thing, wouldn't they? And I think I hear him in the background saying this because of his probable discontentment with the idea that somebody that is potentially guilty by law should be afforded some contentment. Now, I may not be accurate in saying that, but it depends on the severity, I suppose, of the fault. Now, what I believe that this means, or that it implies, that regardless of what the situation is, the person that is being fined or having this financial burden, financial punishment placed on them, it should not be to such a degree that they are unable to provide for themselves afterwards. And I think that there is some merit in that. And I would see where the contrary opinion comes in, where this idea of contentment, but also thinking back at some earlier iterations, perhaps even 1,000 years, well, maybe not 1,000 years, but it could be 1,000 years before this, in which the punishments for murder were not necessarily the sacrifice of one's property or prosperity, that they still had certain rights. Maybe they sacrificed a small sum, whatever the case might be. They had to pay a certain amount depending on the person who was murdered, depending on what class they were from. And I see that there is a potential issue with the idea of contentment. Well, what exactly is this contentment? We can see a situation in which a court may take mostly everything from somebody, but gives them the bare necessities to survive, and that may barely be enough. And then there may be the type of contentment in which a person of quite lofty status maintains quite a lofty status, even after a high fault. But of course the idea here is that what we are concerned with is the manner of the fault and the severity of the punishment being accorded with the severity of the crime. So the second clause here, and a merchant likewise, saving to him his merchandise. So I wonder, in this case, what the distinction is necessarily. Of course, coined money is a thing in this period. And so the punishments I would have to imagine are monetarily based, that what they collect is coinage rather than property. Now, I could be wrong about that, but in terms of merchandise, what I see here is the merchant as a businessman. He owns goods that he is going to bring to market, whether he exports that outside of the nation or within the nation. His merchandise is a form of his property that has yet to be realized in some medium of exchange of value. And since it doesn't have that asset status, I guess, that he ought to be able to retain that property. So in some sense, this subclause, the second subclause, is a defense against private property or arbitrary seizure of that property. That if he has committed some fault, let's say it's a medium-sized fault in which he has to pay a fair sum, and perhaps it's all that he has monetarily, or at least close to all that he has, saving to him his contentment. So he is given perhaps a small sum, or he is able to retain a small sum for his contentment. He gives what he owes for his crime, but he also maintains his merchandise for his business. That is quite a protection for the individual, quite a protection for the merchant. Subclause 3, and any others villain than ours shall be likewise immersed, saving his wainage, if he falls into our mercy. So, first word that we need to understand here is the word spelled V-I-L-L-A-I-N, villain. So, from what I understand, that this person, this villain, is a type of unfree or lowly peasant. They are tied to some land of a lord. They had more rights than slaves, but they could not leave their land without their lord's permission. So the context here, we are referring to a non-free man, where we began this clause with a free man shall not be immersed for a small fault. And now it's saying any others, non-free man, this villain, other than ours, shall be likewise immersed, saving his wainage if he falls into our mercy. Wainage refers to a villain's livelihood, which it can include his tools, essential farming equipment, almost akin to what we were seeing in the previous subclause of the merchant's merchandise. And so this protection would ensure that his livelihood is maintained. The other thing that immediately comes to mind is the point of view, the perspective, the personage. That in this way of writing, I've mentioned this before, but it is written by the barons, the baronial class, but it is written in the king's name. The king was coerced into signing this document, King John. So if he falls into our mercy, if he falls into the king's dominion under his court. So we have protections for free persons for the severity of their crimes that are, the attempt is to reduce the arbitrary nature of the punishment of those crimes, financial punishment of those crimes, and to attribute to those crimes a punishment that is paralleled or equivalent to the severity of their crimes. We have the protections of property for a few different types of classes, including non-free persons, of the merchant class to protect their merchandise, and of the villain, these serfs that have the right to keep their equipment even if they commit some offense that causes them to have to pay some fine. And none of the said amerciaments shall be assessed, but by the oath of honest and lawful men of the vicinage. So this type of language we've seen before. There is this identification of the appropriateness, but also the importance of having local jurisdictions, and that there must be people that are invested in the local community that have some judicial authority. None of these financial crimes, or none of these financial punishments, shall be assessed, but by a person who has been approved, held up to some standard by the oath of honest and lawful men of that vicinage. So the idea of honesty making its way into this subclause, I think, is something that might offer us a good reflection. So let's consider this for a moment. What is honesty? Honesty, given a simple Google definition, is free of deceit and untruthfulness, sincere, used to persuade someone of truth of something. Certainly difficult to screen for, but important nonetheless. I think that it is included here. And putting aside what we may know about English history and the fragility of law during that period. It's another Humean thing to say. But just thinking about the merits of this distinction, free of deceit and untruthfulness, that at the very least there was the prudence to consider that something free of deceit, which the word itself, the action of practice of deceiving someone by concealing or misrepresenting the truth, that almost the whole point of this clause is to prevent against that deceit, to prevent against something that is arbitrarily imposed. And getting law to the point where it is not something that is completely arbitrary, that the efficiency of a group of people or individuals that are participating in that system, for it to actually make sense, for their sacrifice to pay off, is not an easy one. And to get the laws to align such that there is this concordance of values across the board, it's almost impossible, but this is society. There are sacrifices, and there are benefits. But by the oath of honest and lawful men. Lawful is another important term here because, as I've mentioned, the fragility of law in the olden days, let's say, is not something that can be understated. There was a lot of undercutting authority and of dispute among faction. And have somebody that is first principled, which I think goes in tandem with being honest, but also lawful, recognizing that there has to be this order in society for these various relationships to exist without having this tumultuous or faction-based clan-like warring between these parties continually. Subclause 5, earls and barons shall not be immersed but by their peers, and after the manner of their offense. So this is a luxury that is given to the noble class here. But we can see where this leads. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and that's not to say that we've reached a place of absolute alignment, but it is interesting that in the 13th century, the value was certainly there. And I should get away from saying that. I mentioned this earlier, that humanity has been around for some time, and the mind has seen different problems in different lights in many different situations. And so it is not beyond a person in the Middle Ages to recognize that perhaps this is something that should be extended to a class that is larger than the earls or the barons. But I don't mean to be overly liberal here. I do recognize that distinction in society, that Aristotelian distinction among the slave class, if we will, and the productive class. Earls and barons shall not be immersed, but by their peers, and after the manner of their offense. So in the second part of the subclause, we see a reiteration of the first, that the manner of the offense is the important part, that there should not be this arbitrary financial punishment for some offense. And I think that we can interpret the first part of this, that the earls and barons shall be immersed but by their peers, shall not be immersed but by their peers. We could think about this sort of pessimistically, saying that, of course, this class of people just wanted to be separate from the king and to expand their right, their prerogative, expand their authority and their power. And of course, there's an element of that, but all the same, the desire still for justice, but on the part of their peers. Again, possibly the peers of the nobility would be looking out for each other, such that any punishment would be quite minimal. But if they were true, given that last clause, oath of honest and lawful men, then the peers are people of similar social standing. Perhaps they don't have some investment into a particular dilemma, into a particular injustice. Just like we have our judgment by peers here, that citizens of this country get together to judge one another. And I think a lot of this is to avoid that arbitrary execution, that sort of top-down execution of justice, and make it more organic. Subclause 6, no man of the church shall be immersed after the quantity of his spiritual benefice, but after his lay tenement, and after the quantity of his offense. So what is this term, lay tenement? So lay tenement refers to land or property held by a lay person, a non-clergy member. So no man of the church shall be immersed after the quantity of his spiritual benefice. Now this is implying that of his spiritual position, of his institutional position as a part of as a member of the church, that these matters are separate from secular affairs, and he cannot be punished by those possessions. It's like the merchant's merchandise, or the villain's wainage. It is something that is fundamental to his work, that he must maintain that and keep it. But after his lay tenement, after the quantity of his offense. So lay tenement in this sense is his secular possessions, landed property that he may own that is separate from the church, from the ecclesiastical. So in sum, for this clause, I find a few things interesting. One, I find it interesting that it is not just specific prerogatives adhered to the baronial class. It is of a variety of classes. We see the free man, we see the merchant, we see the villanage, or the villain, we see the barons, and we see the church official. Almost all classes of man that is outside of the kingly authority. Of course, this is written on behalf of the king, so it would not make much sense if there was this attribution to the king. But nonetheless, we can see this separation of prerogative out into the periphery of society. Another word instead of separation may be proliferation or expansion out into society. So clause 15, making of bridges and banks. So my apologies, but today is a new day. And it's been some time since my last recording. So let's get right into it. Left off last time with clause 15, making of bridges and banks. The text reads, "No town nor freeman shall be distrained to make bridges nor banks, but such as of old time and of right have been accustomed to make them in the time of King Henry, our grandfather." So in order to dissect this, I think understanding a little bit of history is important. But for my own part, defining real quick that word distrain, it means to seize someone's property to obtain payment of rent or other money owed. So as far as I can understand, this clause is meant to, like with many clauses, limit arbitrary abuses. Now, in the time of King Henry, there's a broader conversation that I'd like to open up here. In the time of King Henry, there's obviously some precedent that was set. And so the question is, well, what is that precedent? And why is it something that is valuable? So some historical context here. In medieval England, bridges and riverbanks or embankments were crucial for travel, trade, and protection against floods. Local communities and landowners were often expected to maintain certain stretches of road, bridges, or flood defenses as part of their feudal obligation. Now, over time, the kings and or barons sometimes tried to impose new or extended obligations on the people or towns to construct or maintain infrastructure beyond what they were originally responsible for. So there's a bit of an irony here, in the sense that this clause doesn't get at the original obligation. The question of, well, is the original obligation arbitrary? I think from the American standpoint, then we would probably say that it is. Every citizen has an obligation to their state. Every serf has an obligation to their feudal lord. And I suppose it's a matter of relationship. But all the same, in this context, we are talking about that particular relationship. So, of the base, of the custom, and of the precedent, we are talking about the things that are mentioned here. The road, the bridges, the general infrastructure, the protection against floods, the banks. So let's think for a moment the context of this clause. Of the feudal institution, there are certain requirements that any subordinate has to the owner of the land, of the nobility. And I think it can be said in an interesting manner that the towns also have some responsibility. Now, the local lords and monasteries, they took the tolls. They were responsible for, the infrastructure of the institution, such that they took in the monies, they delegated the labor, and the constructions were completed. Now, it is either the case that a tenant or a free man may owe a bridge repair as a part of custom or as a part of labor, where they might be paid to do it. Now, Bridges were often made out of wood, so as we can imagine, bridge repairs were much more frequent in those days. At least the obligation would be much more frequent. Riverbanks, and in this case, of course, we're not talking about bank in the monetary sense when the title says making of bridges and banks. It is of an area on the edge of a river, an area that is prone to flood. And these too needed regular maintenance. Now, the question is, well, who maintained these areas of the banks? And these would be the landowners that lived along the rivers. And so they were responsible for maintaining the area against flooding because it was their land, their property. Now, the communities in some situations would also probably be responsible for that, where the communal effort is expected to maintain the integrity of the whole. And then in some cases, on a higher level, the lords would organize drainage ditches or the building of dikes. So on the whole, as I get my mind wrapped around this here, I can't stop thinking about this idea of precedent and the idea of what is considered arbitrary. And there is an essay by David Hume on the parties in England, of which he has these two primary peoples. One that is more of the court and one is more of the country. On one hand, you have more of a liberatory spirit, and on the other, you have more of a conservative, bounded, trusted, perhaps, state of mind. Now, in the case of the Magna Carta, in the case of Clause 15, we're talking about more of a country-oriented clause, in the sense that the general spirit that underlies this is a liberatory one, even if it is more geared towards the baronial class. Of course, the town and freeman is mentioned here. And what is being broken away from is the authority of the court, what they consider to be an arbitrary abuse of power. And again, my difficulty with this is, how is it an arbitrary abuse of power, given that the original precedent was not set in some bounds that were well outside of this context? Now, I could be wrong about this. Now, I mentioned that there is that element of communal responsibility. And in free societies, we all participate in a way to fill the gaps and to fill labor where labor is needed. The market does a lot of good in this regard. But at the bottom of that are human beings with the human experience at its core. And there's something, while it may seem obvious, there's something, I think, productive in just taking some time to calm the mind a little bit and to focus on the implications of that. That at the bottom of all of this is mind. And I don't wish to say that of precedent, that it's always arbitrary. I suppose I should define arbitrary. Otherwise, everything becomes arbitrary. So, I'm looking on Google here. Arbitrary is based on random choice or personal whim, rather than any reason or system. Now there is some obvious difficulties here, because rather than any reason, there's choice there, and there is personal whim. Personal decisions and justifications may have many reasons behind them, but it is only, I think, certain systems of thought, or thoughts in general, opinions in general, that are congruent or conducive to some stability when it comes to society. Now with mathematics, I like the definition a little bit better, of unspecified value. And in a way, it's difficult to grasp the concept. We can have something, but much like an empty vessel, it's not filled with anything. It's not that the vessel is nothing. Of course, it is a thing, and it has a purpose. But it's not fulfilling that purpose. So we have some quantity, for example. It has no value. It has no relative context to give it its value. No relational context to give it its value. And I think it could be said that the arbitrariness of something decreases when the known value of something in its context has greater utility. I think that there's room there for refinement, but at least it's a start to get away from everything is relative or everything is arbitrary. So going back to the pot example, if we have this vase, that the whole purpose of the vase is to, or the vessel, the whole point of the vessel is to store water, let's say. And right now it's empty. So the value of the pot is in part determined by its potential, but also by its capacity to perform the purpose that it is made for. And so I would say that the pot or the vessel would be less valuable if it does not hold water than when it does. Now there are certain situations in which it would make this would be more or less true. From a market standpoint, let's say, or from a standpoint in which the vessel has yet to be sold, we would be concerned about a person's need for a vessel to hold water in. We wouldn't necessarily be immediately concerned with the vessel holding water. But when a person has bought the vessel, and now they are concerned, let's say, that I'm thinking about an ancient context where access to water is a little less simple, easy, let's say. For example, I could reach down, grab my canteen, go into the kitchen, and pour myself some more water and have a full canteen. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, to support this argument, that the vessel that we're thinking about in an ancient context, a person that has bought this vessel must travel a mile, let's say, to draw water and to put it in this vessel. If the vessel is empty, in this situation, it could be said that the value of the vessel is less than when compared to the situation in which it fulfills its purpose, when it's full of water. So even within this analogy, there are plenty of contextually significant factors. And I think by this, it makes thinking about custom and precedent a little bit more difficult, especially when we're thinking about a period in which there's an acceleration in arbitrary abuses, they're moving away from established responsibilities, and then all of a sudden new responsibilities are being added, and then the question is raised, well, for what purpose? And it's not as though that the purpose may not be there, because new precedents can be set, new customs can be established, if there is sufficient reason to do it. But if the purpose is hollow, if there is a vessel, let's say, in the modern context, a massive vessel, purpose again is storing water. Yet I have this canteen and a water spout that I can go to within a couple of steps. It's not really all that practical to require of me to use this massive vessel. It might be prudent to have it in case of an emergency, but for everyday practical purposes, it's not really all that necessary. And by that, if it was a requirement, it would be seen as a bit arbitrary, because we have something that probably is said to have some value, but it's unspecified in the mathematical sense. It's unspecified to the part of the person that is obliged to participate in that purpose. Now again, just to smooth over that surface, it can be the case, again, that customs can be established, new customs can be established. And that might also mean that the spirit of liberty might come up against the establishment of something that might seem arbitrary, but by ignorance of that, of understanding the purpose of something, the resistance can be maybe counterproductive. No town or freeman shall be distrained to make bridges nor banks, but such as of old time and of right have been accustomed to make them in the time of King Henry, our grandfather. So we'll continue this discussion about arbitrary abuses and how exactly to reconcile them. Of course, this is one way to try to establish that, to say, well, there shall be no new way to maintain this order other than the way that it has been established, because the ways in which are now being introduced are unreasonable, let's say. So clause 16, defending of banks. No banks shall be defended from henceforth, but such as were in defense in the time of King Henry our grandfather, by the same places and the same bounds as they were wont to be in his time. So this clause is fairly similar to the last. We have the defending banks as opposed to making of bridges and banks. But again, I want to briefly go over exactly what these banks are. They are built to prevent flooding from large rivers, Thames, or Humber. They're especially important in low-lying agricultural areas, areas that were, of course, prone to flooding. The defense in this situation is meant to keep them strong enough to keep them competent to hold back the floodwaters. So the local landowners and the tenants, again required by customary law, this would be the law in time of King Henry, to main the section of the bank that bordered their property. And this was known as banking duty, and it often passed with the land as it was a heritable obligation. In the broader community sense, they might also maintain shared banks through communal labor, especially near towns or along main roads. Monasteries in some cases, or abbots, oversaw defensive banks and dikes. since they held large tracts of river-adjacent land. In terms of the enforcement, local courts were responsible for that domain, or the manorial court. The court enforced the failures to maintain the banks by an amercement or some fine. So the techniques that they used to maintain these defensive structures was wattle fencing, earthworks, and wooden. Workers would build up drainage channels, build up embankments, and sometimes plant vegetation to stabilize the ground. And so because of the continual erosion, accumulation of water through rains, tides, annual labor was necessary. So I don't think there's much more to be said about the general spirit of this clause, as it has already been stated in the previous. So clause number 17, holding pleas of the crown. No sheriff, constable, escheator, coroner, or any other, our bailiffs shall hold pleas of our crown. So the first thing that I want to know is this word that I'm most likely mispronouncing, escheator. Now, an escheator is a person of royal office. They're responsible for managing lands that reverted to the crown. These lands that reverted to the crown were called escheats. Typically, when someone died without an heir or was convicted of a felony or treason, these lands would then be reverted. So the constable originally managed royal castles and their garrisons, but later had law enforcement duties. In addition, in a local context, constables had some role in policing. Now the coroner, this is something that we know of today. Their job is to investigate sudden or suspicious deaths, often with a jury, and record the facts. The sheriff, an enforcer of law, chief royal officer in a county, responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, organizing militia, and overseeing lesser court proceedings. The bailiff, a local steward, manager, or an agent of a lord or the king. They had administrative roles and policing roles. No sheriff, constable, escheator, coroner, nor any other our bailiffs shall hold pleas of our crown. Now, what is a plea of the crown? A plea to the crown is a serious offense. The crown's court is going to only hear those serious offenses. And usually, if the king's immediate interests were concerned. So in a broader context, what can we say about this? Again, we go back to matters of a potential arbitrary nature. In the sense that if we took each one of the offices and the responsibilities therein, and they all had the ability to hear these serious criminal cases, what would be the effect? Well, surely each one of them would have the power that's supposed to be invested in the crown's court into their own hands. So So on one hand, we have this diversified set of powers, but also less formalized, in the sense that the central court that has a particular interest is not able to be made known of these serious cases, and the officers can decide based on their own will, independently perhaps of a jury. Clause 18. The king's debtor dying, the king shall be paid first. If any that hold of us lay fee do die, and our sheriff or bailiff do show our letters patents of our summon for debt, which the dead man did owe to us, it shall be lawful to our sheriff or bailiff to attach or enroll all goods and chattels of the dead, being found in the said fee, to the value of the same debt, by the sight and testimony of lawful men, so that nothing thereof shall be taken away, until we be chiefly or clearly, paid of the debt. 2. And the residue shall remain to the executors to perform the testament of the dead. 3. And if nothing be owing unto us, all the chattel shall go to the use of the dead, saving to his wife and children their reasonable parts. So starting with this first subclause, so in terms of perspective, we've talked about this before, but it's obvious here that this is being written, regardless of if it's being written by the nobility, it's in the personage of the king or the king's bench. The king's debtor dying, the king shall be paid first. So they're saying that if there's any person that has been lended money from the king's possession, the officers of the royal court, the sheriff or bailiff, show the records, the documents, the patents, for which the debtor is obliged. They will take of him the value of his property that was sufficient or equivalent for the debt, but no more, and left to the will of the dead. And the rest, assuming that what is left over is beyond that of the debt, that the debt has been satisfied, go to the dead's family, the use of the dead, saving to his wife and children their reasonable parts. So again, it's a correction against the potential abuse. That abuse being that if somebody had died, if they had owed a debt, who is to say that the king could not just take everything from this person? And of course, for this to be written means that it likely was an abuse that was practiced. And there's also a certain wisdom, I think, in understanding, there's also a certain wisdom observing the levels here. There's a wisdom in understanding the importance, the value of fairness. There is a sense, there is a reason in which for one to have taken value and agreed to be obligated to repay it, that regardless of the circumstance, that even if the person is alive or has perished, that they should, by virtue of their remainder, to satisfy their obligations. But it is not fair, given this clause, to take more than the person had owed. And so I think that of the various qualities that support honesty, I think that we can say that this is a case in which we find an attempt to codify honesty on the part of the king's court. So verse 19, purveyance for a castle. No constable nor his bailiff shall take corn or other chattels of any man, if the man be not of the town where the castle is. But he shall forthwith pay for the same, unless that the will of the seller was to respite the payment. And if he be of the same town, the price shall be paid unto him within 40 days. Okay, so in approaching this clause, I want to keep in mind that we are looking for the spirit of liberty, how it is as it is represented here. On one hand, we don't want to dig too far into this and see something that we think is there that might not be there, but also at the same time give credit where credit is due if this is an innovation that's worth noting. So there's a few words that I'd like to go over and define. We've done this before, but since we haven't done it for a little bit, I think it's good to do it again. The first is the constable, what this person is, what his role is. Now, in terms of the etymology, the word constable comes from the Latin stabuli, or count of the stable, originally the officer in charge of the stables of a noble or monarch. In the medieval role, by the 13th century, a constable was no longer just a stable master. He was a royal or noble officer, responsible for defense and management of a castle or fortified town. So his duties included maintaining garrisons, collecting provisions like grain, livestock, and arms for the castle, enforcing order within his jurisdictions. Now the bailiff, the etymology of this word from the Old French and from the Latin, means carrier or guardian. In the medieval context, a bailiff was a local officer or steward, acting under the direct authority of a lord, sheriff, or constable. So his responsibilities included collecting rents and dues, enforcing the law and carrying out writs, overseeing manorial courts, or assisting higher officials in administration. So he would be helping in obtaining these supplies that we're talking about here. So it says, no constable nor his bailiff shall take corn or other chattels. Now this word chattel comes from the Old French meaning property, related to the Latin capitale, which means capital, property, or livestock. The meaning in law refers to movable personal property as opposed to land. Examples include livestock, grain, tools, household goods. This is contrast with real property, immovable things like land or buildings. So corn is a good example, but also other provisions we can imagine, like weapons or materials that would be necessary for living quarters, perhaps bandages, cloth, all of these sort of fundamental items that would be necessary to maintain a garrison we have to consider. Okay, so what is the main purpose here? No constable nor his bailiff shall take corn or chattels of any man, if the man be not of the town where the castle is. Okay, so here's the primary place where we have to do some reflecting. The question I have is this sort of an innovation? The abuse, of course, would be that if a constable or bailiff was in some neighboring town or a far-off town, perhaps a town that had a a quite sizable fortress and garrison, that they would move to neighboring towns and just take corn and chattels, various goods that were needed for that place, for the fortifications of that place. Now, on one hand, this is good for individual liberty, because you don't have your stuff being taken from you in an uncertain manner. But on the other hand, in terms of national defense, if there was an invasion from overseas, this might limit things, I think, to a degree. But he shall forthwith pay for the same, unless that the will of the seller was to respite the payment. Now, the word respite means a temporary delay, a postponement, or reprieve. So the meaning in context here, if the seller was willingly granted a delay in receiving payment, then the constable or bailiff didn't have to pay immediately. Otherwise, they were required to pay immediately on the spot, or within 40 days, as it says in the second part of the clause. It says, and if he be of the same town, the price shall be paid unto him within 40 days. So I suppose in the second part of this, there is the possibility of a sense of urgency. So they would have this 40-day grace period. If they needed supplies immediately for the garrison and they didn't have the money, it's somewhat understandable. But the main point of this seems, at least from the context of liberty, is that there is an idea that those who own particular chattels, or goods, fundamental goods, let's say corn, that it is not expected, is not appropriate for a constable to move to a neighboring town and to take from those people. And again, there's, I think, multiple ways in which this can be seen, interpreted. Some of it might have an effect on liberty. Some of it might have an effect on practicality in terms of not wanting to deprive a neighboring town just in case of a defense. And here I think particularly on the border towns between England and Scotland, for which there were constant disputes and conflicts, you would want each town to be sort of able to provide their own castle with goods such that they can supply a garrison. But again, also from the commoner's perspective, you would not want your crop to be taken sort of arbitrarily to another town that has nothing to do with your own defense. So moving on to the next clause. This is clause number 20. Doing of castle ward. No constable shall distrain any knight to give money for keeping of his castle, if he himself will do it in his proper person, or cause it to be done by another sufficient man, if he may not do it himself for a reasonable cause. The subclause here is, and if we lead or send him to an army, he shall be free from castle ward for that time that he shall be with us, and free in our host, for the which he has done service in our wars. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is to determine what castle ward is. We know what constable is. Perhaps define the word distrain. So the etymology comes from the Old English weird, W-E-A-R-D, which meant guard, protection. In the feudal context, castle ward was the duty owed by a tenant, often a knight or a landholder, to help maintain and defend the lord's castle. This might involve providing men-at-arms for guard duty, contributing supplies, stone, timber, or money, for castle upkeep, serving personally in times of siege. So this was part of the broader feudal services that the landholders rendered to their overlord in exchange for their land. So it's worthy noting that by the 13th century, many of these services could be commuted into money payments instead of personal attendance, but the obligation still existed as a legal burden on the land. Now the word distrain means to seize goods or property as a legal compulsion for unpaid dues or obligations. So let's go through this again. So no constable shall distrain any knight to give money for keeping of his castle. So the first thing that comes to mind here is the role of the knight in medieval society. From what I understand, he was not a nobleman, but he occupied this interesting capacity insofar as he had the ability and perhaps the equipment necessary to go to war for his overlord if needed. But his capacity was greater than that of a commoner that was compulsed to go to war. So let's break down the role of the knight. So a knight was a mounted warrior who served a lord or a king. He was expected not only to fight but also to embody chivalry, which was a code of conduct that emphasized loyalty, honor, service to the weak, and devotion to the church. In peacetime, knights often acted as enforcers of their lord's authority, participating in tournaments, guarding castles, or managing parts of estates. With regard to formal distinctions, what made him different from an ordinary soldier? His noble status is one, and I think that this depended on the age. By the High Middle Ages, the 12th to 13th centuries, knighthood had become strongly associated with the lesser nobility. Many knights were nobles by birth, though of a lower rank than earls, dukes, or counts. Others were elevated into knighthood through ceremony and services. But by the later Middle Ages, this title was almost exclusively noble. In terms of landholding, knights typically held land, a fief, from a lord in exchange for military service. Owning land made them part of the feudal structure. They weren't just mercenaries, but bound by obligation. Not all knights were wealthy landowners, but the expectation was that a knight had the means to equip himself. Regarding his training and equipment, knights were distinguished by their military training, begun in youth as a page, then a squire, before being dubbed a knight. They required expensive equipment, horse, armor, weapons, which separated them from foot soldiers, archers, or common levies. Ceremonial knighthood. To become a knight, one underwent a formal dubbing ceremony, often religious in tone, linking knighthood to service to church and to God. This ritual distinction reinforced that knights were a recognized social class, not just fighters. So regarding common soldiers, these were often peasants levied for campaigns, serving on foot with minimal armor or weapons provided by their lords. Men-at-arms were professional warriors, sometimes not of noble birth, but they were heavily armed like knights, but lacking the ceremonial and social recognition. Mercenaries were hired soldiers, sometimes foreign, who fought purely for pay. So that gives us a better idea of what the knight is. So again, no constable shall distrain any knight to give money or keeping of his castle, if he himself will do it in his proper person. So this seems like a big one in terms of liberty as it pertains to a particular class of the nobility, the lower class of the nobility. So again, the constable shall not seize the property, sort of blackmail him, compel him to give money for the keeping of his castle, Now we have to wonder about why this is. Now, outside of the question why, we can surely understand that this has been an abuse that has gone through the culture. Otherwise, this would not be a clause. Would not be something that we'd be discussing. So perhaps then the arbitrary abuse exhibited by the constable, both in this clause but also in the former, were quite rampant, such that they had to be curtailed. But what would we say then about this relationship between the constable and the knight? Now the knight, as we discussed, he is this lesser nobility type figure. He is bound to a certain moral conduct. He has a particular set of skills, fighting skills. He has a degree of wealth, I suppose, not very much compared to some others. But the need of money is sort of a perennial problem. I think that there are many abuses that are suffered upon people that are the cause of somebody else's desire for money. And as I mentioned earlier, this arbitrary abuse, I would imagine, can go quite far in its exercise. Now I should mention, if there's a sound in the background that seems a little off, that is my cat snoring. But in any case, no constable shall distrain any knight to give money for keeping of his castle, if he himself will do it in his proper person. So he is referring to the knight. So there's a sense of the desire in this clause to protect the knight from arbitrary financial abuse on the part of the constable. So obviously, if he will do it in his proper person, then why would he be blackmailed into giving money to the constable for keeping of his castle? Now, the other provision is that he can find somebody else to do it that is of sufficient capacity. Maybe another knight, for example. And I think this is interesting here. The spirit of it is interesting. If he may not do it himself for a reasonable cause. Now, this is a bit of a gray area, because what is a reasonable cause? It would have to be debated in a court if this was to be litigated. But given that it is so open, I think that the idea here is that that reasonable cause, although it is not certain, it leaves room for debate. It is possible that this man, the knight of the lesser nobility, may have some good reason not to be doing castle ward. And rather than submit him to arbitrary abuses, he should be heard and respected for essentially who he is, the spirit of who he is. And I find this interesting. Now, of course, this is limited to a particular class and everything, but it doesn't really matter. It's still an interesting provision. The subclause. And if we lead or send him to an army, he shall be free from the castle ward for the time that he shall be with us, and free in our host, for the which he has done service in our wars. So by respect of him participating in the war, which is part of his obligation, I would imagine, he is not expected then somehow to be split in half and fulfill this castle ward obligation to the constable. And so there's this further respect, I think, that's being placed on the man of the night, that his obligations should be respected and not unreasonably multiplied, such that it would be impossible for him to oblige what he is responsible for. So clause 21, taking of horses, carts, and wood. No sheriff nor bailiff of ours, or any other, shall take the horses or carts of any man to make carriage, except he pay the old price limited, that is to say, for carriage with 2 horse, x.d. a day. For 3 horses, I guess this is, I'm not too sure exactly what this means. Either this could be Roman numerals or some other notation, but it's for 3 horse, it says xiv.d. a day. The subclass here is no domain, cart of any spiritual person or knight or any lord shall be taken by our bailiffs. 3. Nor we, nor our bailiffs, nor any other shall take any man's wood for our castles, or other our necessaries to be done, but by the license of him whose wood it shall be. So starting with the first subclause here. No sheriff, no bailiff of ours, or any other, shall take the horses or carts of any man to make carriage. Okay, so the first thing that I want to discuss is this carriage. What exactly is this? So we have to imagine that of the higher levels in the society, of the nobility class, and of the king's apparatus, that civil apparatus, they may requisition carts or horses to haul the goods. We could think about a situation for war, or any number of situations. So it is saying that they shall not take these from people unless he pay the old price limited, that is to say, for carriage with 2 horse. And it's giving a rate, which I think is interesting. I think there's some positives and negatives to this. But before I go into that, the first thing I want to say is that x.d, I think d is the denomination, denarius, which is the Latin word for penny. And then x would be more that Roman numeral, so 10 pennies a day. This is the 2 horses, and then the 3 horses would be 14, because it's xiv, so 14, and then .d, which is denarius or penny, so 14 pence a day. So not only is this payment a structured payment such that it would prevent against potential abuses of the sheriff or of the bailiff or any other person that's responsible for gathering this material for the king's carriages, but it also gives a daily rate, so they have to keep on paying this per day, assuming that they continue to use the horses and the carts. Now, one unfortunate consequence of this is that this doesn't prevent or control for the change or the volatility in monies. This is more of like a something that is well for a particular reign of a king that would have to be constantly updated. But again, we see that we are preventing against the arbitrary abuse of the individual, where perhaps a sheriff or a bailiff may not return the horse or the cart, or they would purchase or rent the horse or cart for money that is way under price, and it would severely disadvantage the commoner in that situation. So here we have a clause that's specifically looking out for the commoner. And I have to wonder to myself, what exactly is it about this relationship that we are focusing on here? On one sense, it seems that I've covered it, but on another, there's something deeper, more fundamental about the relationship that is expected now. When I say that, I mean if it is written into law, there is force behind it. And if there's force behind it, there's this cultural expectation. In the broad sense, this cultural expectation can be just or not just. But in the sense that we are speaking about the spirit of liberty here and about the justice that we can see from it, I think it's clear that the force is meant to protect. It's looking at the individual. It is looking at the commoner and saying, your time, your money, your chattels are valuable. And they're not just valuable to the civic body. They're valuable to you. We are recognizing the innate value that this has for your livelihood. And by extension, the value, I think, is also being attributed to the man himself. Because why would we value his things if we don't value him? So the second subclause here. Now, I looked up this word. It's spelled Demesne. I think it's pronounced like domain or domain, even though it doesn't even look close to that. But in any case, no domain, cart, of any spiritual person or knight, or any lord, shall be taken by our bailiffs. Okay. By any spiritual person. So this gives us an idea about the respect that the church had in this era. I've been reading relatively recently, struggling to keep up with it at times, but I've been in the 16th century England, in which there is King Henry VIII's reign had just ended. And of course, in his reign, we have the separation between England and the Romish Church. But Henry was still Catholic. And the undercurrent of this, we had the Protestant Reformation that was occurring. And in the mix of all of this, the Catholic lands were taken from them, given to the civil magistrates. And it just makes me reflect that times change, of course, because in the 16th century this would not have been respected, because all of their goods were taken from them. So the spirit of liberty here is preserved, while in a later period, a couple hundred years after, that spirit in this context is diminished. Now we remember that this is coming on behalf of the king's establishment. This is the personage that we are speaking from the perspective of. And so now there is this recognition, a civil recognition of the rights of the spiritual individuals, the rights of the knights and the rights of the lords. The third subclause, nor we, nor our bailiffs, nor any other, shall take any man's wood for our castles, or other our necessaries to be done, but by the license of him whose wood it shall be. So this is a massive shift to a commoner. You have to think that this type of person is quite low on that feudal structure. It's possible that a noble may be involved in this, especially if their lands are rich in timber, and they might be involved in a case where a bailiff might be taking the wood for a castle or whatever. But the wood that a merchant, or for the lack of a better term, like a businessman, the chattels that he gains to himself are for him. His obligations are paid to his lord, but these are for him, and they are not to be taken arbitrarily by the king's establishment. And in fact, even more so over than that, he has the license, he has the capacity to outline what that relationship should be, if he should choose to give that to them. And I would have to imagine that he would outline his rates for the purchasing of wood. Now again, here, as much as the former, we have to consider how important this is in terms of establishing the sanctity, in terms of establishing the importance of the individual relative to the operating or the authority that is in charge. Now, one thought that has come to mind, I've been thinking about it more and more lately as the years go by. I've been thinking that democracy in this country may not be long for this world. And it's an unfortunate thing, but I think it's a part of a natural progression of things. And I think as a consequence, agency will probably be sacrificed to a degree as well. Now, I've been approaching this with such sort of moral absolutism that sanctity of the individual is a good thing. And I think that there is a place here, at least to mention, that depending on the age, depending on the state of culture, in a very fine and, here I think of Plato, I think about the statesman, in a very nuanced way, there is a role for this drawing back of agency, such that the reestablishment of order can take place. And I'm not sure what exactly to do with it. As much as I value personal autonomy, individual liberty, strong individual agency, and all this sort of thing, there is also a beauty in collectivization. I think there are various forms of collectivization, just as there are various ways in which the individual can be ontologically oriented. Now, the consequences of the numerous orientation I don't think is as destabilizing potentially as a strong centralized order that is off its axis in terms of good governance. But I'll leave that thought as it is. Now, the last clause of this episode I want to get into. This is the last page, the last clause on this page, actually. I think there are 3 more pages or so of clauses to go through, so we probably have another episode to get through, and then we'll be done with this series. But clause 22, how long felons' lands shall be holden by the king. We will not hold the lands from them that have been convicted of felony, but 1 year and 1 day, and then those lands shall be delivered to the lords of the fee. So in the 13th century, well, maybe I should say, the word felon, in the etymological sense, from the Old French, meant wickedness, treachery, or crime. It's from a more rooted sense of a cruel or wicked person. In Anglo-Norman and medieval English law, a felony wasn't just any crime. It was a serious crime that caused forfeiture of a person's lands and goods to the king. This could include treason, betrayal of the king, homicide or murder, rape, serious theft or robbery, arson. So the key feature of a felony was not just severity, but that it broke the bond of loyalty between the offender and his lord or king, triggering a forfeiture. So in terms of this forfeiture, lands and goods of a convicted felon became the property of the crown. This was one way the monarchy gained revenue. Escheat, after the king took possession, the lands could eventually escheat or esquite, revert to the lord who originally granted them once the king had exercised his rights. and loss of rights, felons also lost the protection of law. In some cases, they were considered attainted, meaning civilly dead, unable to pass on inheritance. So this is an interesting clause, a potentially dangerous one, depending on the nature of the crime. So again, we will not hold the lands of them that be convicted of felony, but 1 year and 1 day. So what can we say about setting a time or a limit to the amount of time that the king holds the lands? There's a few things that come to mind. One is, who committed the felony? Was it the lord or nobleman that actually, well, not actually, but that had possession of the land, that was responsible for the serfs that were on it? Or was it, in fact, a commoner, more of a serf type person? In this case, they didn't really own the land, but they operated on it by the noble's grant. I would have to imagine that the forfeiture of land would be of more of the nobility type class. If a serf committed a crime, I suppose the king could also take the land from the noble. But this clause would also then protect against the individual and the noble, maybe. It depends on it seems like it delegates the responsibility back down to the noble and his relationship to that tenant, if they wanted to continue the relationship or not, but the land would at least return to the noble. Now, lords of the fee is an interesting expression. Fee is a feudal estate or a fief, that is land granted by a lord to a vassal in exchange for service. Lord of the fee is the overlord, for whom the convicting felony originally held the land. So I suppose, in my earlier distinction, we can think of this primarily as the underling, the vassal, being responsible for this crime. But also we have to reflect on the graduated nature of this. I think it's certainly possible for a lesser noble to be overseen by a higher, and because of this relationship, I think this could also apply within that class of men. So an example of this would be a knight holds land from an earl. The knight commits a felony. The crown seizes the land for 1 year and a day. After that, the land reverts back to the earl, or the lord of the fee. So this is an obvious protection among the noble class, that there is less of a reason now that the king might use an excuse and also and always potentially use it arbitrarily to say that some minor inconvenience is now a felony because the person on this land had caused some disagreement with the king. And it could also be used in the sense that the king is this, in relation to the noble, he has this relationship such that he does not like the noble, that there are these civil politics that occur in the negative sense. And by this, what comes to be is an antagonistic relationship by which the king can point to any sort of abuse by his knights or underlings, such that he can take his land from him. So I see this as the independence of a particular group, or a particular class, that of the noble classes, the landed class. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. We'll continue on through the last of these clauses with the Magna Carta, but I'm supposing that we will have one more episode in this. So until next time.